Okay, look, we'll get started. Thanks for your patience and sorry for the delays on that. Today we'll be covering installing the Symo Hybrid with the Hybrid Manager. So it's mainly around the communication and the setting up of the system once you've installed it. So there are some other webinars or some other manuals that we have to give more information about installing the battery, and etc. and all on the meter. So we've got some quick guides out there as well. So this will mainly be concentrating on the Hybrid Manager setting up. So the way it works is if you've got any questions, if you can type it into the question pane there, then I've got Balaji and Marcus here on the side who will be able to answer some questions for you. So if there's any questions there, they'll be able to help you out. So just covering today, things that we'll be covering is so just a quick run over the Fronius energy package. So most of you will probably know what that's about. Then the different system options, and then a little bit about the Symo Hybrid and the smart meter, and then into the Hybrid Manager commissioning. And then I'll cover a little bit about three-phase and single-phase loads on a three-phase system, because that's something which get asked quite often. Just to start off with, there's a little bit of a delay when I move across to the next slide, so I'll try and counteract that if possible. So the Fronius energy package consists of three components. So that's the Symo Hybrid, comes in a 3, 4 or 5 kilowatts. The Fronius smart meter, being a three-phase, of course, because it's a three-phase inverter, you'll need the three-phase meter. That comes in a 63 amp or the 50 kA, which is the larger. And then you got the Fronius solar battery, which is a 4.5 kilowatt hours to 12 kilowatt hours nominal, and at 80% depth of discharge. So in terms of what it actually then looks like, so the connection, you've got your PV connected to your inverter, and then the battery is a direct connection to that. Then you have your meter, which is placed in the main switchboard, which uses a Modbus RS485, Modbus RTU connection, so that the system knows where the energies needs to go. So be it then from the PV to the battery to charge it or to discharge it. And then you've got the loads there in the middle. So in terms of system options, the hybrid can just be installed by itself, so it can be used as a normal grid connect inverter, just with your normal PV on there with no meter or with no battery. Then you can add the battery, add the meter, sorry, at a later date if you want to do some energy management, for example, turning on external loads dependent on what the site's doing, if you've got excess energy. And then also then have the battery in there to any excess power will be stored into the battery. When it comes then to the emergency power supply, so the backup function, which will be available mid-year, so you're looking at around June, July this year, that function will be available. And what that is if the grid goes down, the inverter will disconnect through an external contactor, will disconnect from the grid and start up in island mode and provide power when the grid's down. So it can actually do that also without the battery. So so long as there's enough irradiation, enough sun, then you can actually have it in backup mode even if there's no battery connected. Or if you want to go for the full functionality, obviously with the battery connected, makes it then a more efficient or more robust option. Then the Symo Hybrid itself, the inverter, so that then comes in 3, 4 or 5 kilowatts AC rating. So that's the AC rating as the sum of all phases. So if you're looking at the 3 kilowatt version, that's 1 kilowatt per phase, and for the 5, it's at 1.66 kilowatts per phase roughly. Then you can see underneath that you've got the PV input max, which is then 5, 6.5 or 8 respectively. And the reason why that's higher for that particular inverter is because it can produce, let's say for the 3 kilowatt, version. You can produce 3 kilowatts AC, but also the battery can take in 2 kilowatts at the same time. Or let's say you have 2 kilowatts AC, you can do 3 into the battery, depending on which battery you've got. So the Symo, like the series says, it's Symo, short for symmetrical feed-in, is 3-phase. It does only have 1 MPPT, and the reason for that is we've bringing a product out to the market. Also in Europe, we've used one of the trackers for the battery. But if anyone's having difficulty configuring that with one MPPT, we do have some white papers and some information on that, how to help get around that if you get into difficult situations. It is a transformerless inverter, so very high efficiency. Your input range from 150 to 1,000, so in most cases here in Australia you only go up to 600. And you've also got a very high efficiency because the battery is at a high voltage, round trip efficiency of around 90%. IP65, and then also, as I said, as of mid-year, you'll have the backup mode. So the Fronius smart meter can be installed in 2 different spots here. So some of you may have already used the smart meter a fair bit. You've got, when you select the function on there, it talks about feed-in point or consumption path. So when we're talking about the feed-in point, which is pretty much all systems here in Australia, is that it's the loads and the inverter are on the same side of the Fronius meter. So the inverter needs to know, or in the measurements, whatever the smart meter is reading needs to be, the value of the inverter needs to be taken away from that. So if you're looking at the emergency power function, that's where the switch would sit. Before, so like on the meter needs to go between the contactor and the utility meter, so that when the grid comes back, the meter can detect it. The other point, which is shown on the Datamanager or the hybrid manager as being the consumption path, that would look like this. So you can see essentially the inverter is on the grid side of the smart meter, the Fronius smart meter, not on the load side. So that rarely happens here in Australia unless you've got like gross metering, possibly for New South Wales, but they're coming off there anyway. So this is, and that particular constellation could get used in Europe. So we'll get on to the Symo Hybrid commissioning. So in terms of setting up the inverter itself, when you first switch it on, it's like all of the Snap inverter range. It comes up with English on the display, and I'll just play this little video, and that'll go through, and I'll just talk you way through that. So here, so when you press then English, it'll say wait, and it'll ask you to select the country setup. So in Australia, some people get confused with using the 50 Hertz. Australia is 50 Hertz, but you want to select Setup Australia is the one you want to set up for. So when you do that, it'll take about 30 seconds or something, or a bit longer, until it actually loads the country setup. All the lights will flash on and off, and then it'll come up with wait master ready or wait communication. And if there's DC connected, it'll start up. But this particular model we've set up in our showroom, it doesn't have any DC on that, so you just come up with the info page there. That's the initial just switching on the inverter. So you will probably, because we've set this inverter up before, you may be asked for the time and date, so you just need to enter that as well. Okay, then to the hybrid manager setup. So in the inverter itself, if any of you are familiar with the Datamanager, it's very similar board. We call it the hybrid manager because there is a couple of little differences between this and the Datamanager itself. There is a lot of similarities, but there's the odd little difference. So one of the main things, if you look at the area of the hybrid inverter underneath, you'll see the USB slot and everything is being covered over with a little cover there. That's because the software updates are not done via a USB as opposed to the other Snap inverter range. So the Symo Hybrid has a different software on running in the inverter compared to the other units, and that's why it doesn't get done via USB. So all of the update gets done via the internet, as if you would do a Datamanager update. You also know that there's no master-slave switch on there. That's because only one hybrid can be in the system at one time, because the hybrid inverter is part of an RS485 communication loop, and the inverter is the master in that, and in an RS485 loop you can only have one master in there. So the meter and the battery, if they're in the system, they're in there as slaves. So that's why you don't have the master-slave switch. And the one thing to remember as well is, if you're looking at using external controllers or to control the inverter, you can't control the inverter via RS485 as you can with the other ones, because we use that port for the meter. So if you did want to externally control the inverter, then you can do that via Modbus TCP, which is done via the LAN port if needed. Okay, just to give you a bit more of a close-up of the hybrid manager there, you can see on the left there you've got your Wi-Fi antenna like usual. There's the Modbus termination switch, so depending on where the inverter or the battery or the meter sits in the chain, always the first and the last component needs to have 120 ohm resistor, termination resistor there. So if the hybrid inverter is the first one or the last one, so not in the middle, then that little 120 ohm resistor is already built into the card, but as a switch, so you can turn it on and off. So where that little point's just above where the antenna is, this tiny microscopic little black switch, which you need to switch to either on or off depending on the situation you're in. Then you've got your I/O ports there. You can see the configuration down the bottom with your D minus and D plus for your Modbus ring, and then you've got other I/O ports there which can be configured for different situations. You've got your LAN port there, just like on the Datamanager, to be used for internet if you want to, and then you also can use Modbus TCP commands over that. And then you've got your IP switch like the other, like the normal Datamanager, that little white switch where the 4 LEDs are. So the status LEDs on this, then you've got your WLAN, so your wireless, you've got your power, which is the tick, and then your Solarweb connection, which is then the globe. So the cross doesn't get used on this one because there is no SolarNet, internal SolarNet ring with the hybrid, so that one's not really getting used. So when I'm talking about that 120 ohm resistor, this is just a little bit of an excerpt out of the manual. You can see this particular configuration has the meter first, then the battery, then the inverter. So in this case, the 120 ohm resistor would be connected on the meter, which is usually stuck to the side of it, and then the inverter, so the hybrid manager, would also be set to on. The one in the middle is a battery, which is on the uni gate. That would then both be set to off because it's in the middle. So the other constellation as well, so if the meter's in the middle, then you wouldn't have to bother putting the 120 ohm resistor in the middle. Or if you've got the inverter in the middle, then that's when you would switch off that 120 ohm resistor on the hybrid manager because it's in the middle there. Okay, so getting started with setting up the hybrid manager, then you need to download and install one of the Fronius apps. So either the Solarweb Live app here down the bottom, or the Solarweb Pro. So the Live app is free, and then the Pro app's about $4.99 from the one of the app stores there. So once you've got that then downloaded, then you want to activate the Wi-Fi access point on the display of the inverter. So I've got a little video to show you how to do that. So you go to the setup menu, scroll along, and once you get to setup, then under setup there'll be Wi-Fi access point, the second one down, and then once you've done that, get to that, it's activating the access point there. So once you've got the access point activated,
you'll see on the display says SS on there. So that's the SSID for the actual, that's the network name. In other words, it's a network name. So that'll always be a Fronius underscore, and for the hybrid inverters you have a 239 number. For normal grid connect inverters it'll be a 240 number, and then sequential after that. Then PW is the password, so as with the grid connect inverters it's 1 through to 8, which you didn't need to enter. So that Fronius underscore 239 number, that's also what we call the data logger ID. So when you're registering the system on Solarweb, that's the number you need to have and enter into your system on Solarweb so that it knows where to send the data to. Okay, so once you've got the access point activated, then on your smart device, so you can either be an Android or an iPhone, iPad, so an Apple device. This particular screenshots are done from an Apple device, so they may look a little bit different to your Android, but should be pretty similar in terms of where you need to go. So you want to go into your settings of the device and under Wi-Fi settings, and you'll see appear on the screen there, you'll see that Fronius network, the 239 number. So you want to click on that. Then it'll ask you for the password, which you put through 1 through to 8, and then make sure that it's come up and connected with a tick next to it. It means that it's your device is actually connected to the hybrid manager. So we want to be connected to that because what we want to do is configure the hybrid manager from the smart device. So once you go into the Fronius app, as I said, the live or the pro version. And in this particular case you want to do the technician wizard. So you can see here you've got the choice of a Solarweb wizard or a technician wizard. So with the hybrids you want to do the technician wizard first and then the Solarweb, whereas with the normal grid connect inverters you would usually just do the Solarweb wizard. So we'll run through that first. If by chance your technician wizard is grayed out, then you need to go into the actual app settings. So when you go under general underneath in your smart device, you'll see there's some general settings for all the different apps you've got on your device there, and under that you'll see that you can activate installer mode. So that can also be done in the app of itself. So the Solarweb app, when you go into that and you go under settings, you have the choice there of activating installer mode, and that will then allow the technician wizard not to be grayed out. Okay, so the first thing that will come up is just the general settings. So you need to give it a system name. So this test system was given Symo Hybrid, so you would call it, I don't know, John Smith's hybrid or whatever you want to call it. You may have different other things you'd use, postcodes, etc. Just put in whatever you want there. Then it's got the yield, the feed-in tariff and grid supply tariff. So you don't really need to put them in if you don't want to. They're just like default settings because you can enter them in Solarweb later on. Solarweb will then give you the correct values. So unless you've got someone who's looking at a system which is actually not connected to the internet but has a network and you get to it, then you can put the settings in there if you like, but it's not essential. Then you've got your system time, which it should usually synchronize to your device itself. So whatever the time and date is, and that will automatically synchronize. You just need to set the time zone, so the country, and then the next major city in terms of your time zone settings. Then you would hit forward, and the next step then is setting service password. So in here, because we've set this up before, it has the old password there, but in a new system you would just have the line there, password and repeat password. So to set up the service password, so that the service username is service, possibly you could use something like service123 or use something that you're going to remember, but you want to use something that essentially doesn't get used by the end customer, because this is a section where you can actually adjust and set up export limiting, so that's why it's a separate password for this section. It also has the meter settings in there too. You've set that up, obviously it needs to be letters and numbers, so you can't just have just numbers or just letters. It needs to be a mixture of both for it to be accepted.
So once you've entered that, then it'll ask you to actually log in via that and make sure it works. So you put in service as your username, and then you'd put in the password you just created and hit OK. Then the next section is then your overall, so it's configuring the overall system. So it comes up with system overview. So you get a picture of all the different pieces of the puzzle there. So on the left you've got your PV power if it's connected directly to the inverter. You've got your battery, any other AC sources on the network or on your home network, and then also the meter which pass the meter in. So for the PV power, if there's no modules, some people may be using the hybrid inverter in an AC coupled mode, so you may have a grid connected inverter already there and you just want to add the battery, so you're adding just the hybrid with the battery connected. Then in this case you would deactivate the PV power, but I believe in most cases in Australia at the moment you will have panels directly connected to the hybrid. So you activate it and you put in the amount of DC power you have connected to it. So not the AC power rating of the inverter, but the DC that you've got connected to it in watts as well and not kilowatts. So yeah, if you're not using it, you deactivate it, and then you've got the battery. So when you're doing all this, setting up the hybrid, one of I forgot to mention at the start is you want to do this once everything's been connected. So you've got the inverter connected to the battery's been turned on and all wired up, and you've got the meter all turned on and wired up. So it's all the whole system's been turned on, and then you want to go through with this commissioning here. So with the battery, you've then got the state of charge there, and then you've got if it's available, then it should come up with the actual state of charge. Then if it's the battery is not there, then you want to deactivate it. So that doesn't have any doesn't change how the service modes are or the or any other additional AC sources there. You've also got battery charging from UC grid, so they're talking about utility company grid is the name for that. So if you want to do that, what that does is it allows you to the calibration charge, which gets done every now and then. There's a lot of different factors that depends on when that happens. So it could be once a month, could be once every 2 months. It just depends on how the battery is getting used, if it's being discharged or charged completely. That's a fully automatic function that happens, and the calibration charges means that it charges right up to 100%, so that all the measurements and all the internal measuring equipment and devices are calibrated every now and then to give the correct readings. So then additional producers, so if you've got another AC source, let's say you've got another grid connect inverter in the system, then you would activate that, and then you'd put in the value for in AC of that other inverter. So you might, if you don't have another thing, then you would deactivate that. Then you've got the meter, so choosing consumption path or the feed-in path. As I said, pretty much 100% of installs here in Australia will be in the feed-in path. Once you've selected that, then it will come up with the reading on the display. So here gives you a bit more of an idea what it looks like. So if you tick on the drop-down menu, you can see select activated or deactivated. Activated in this case. With the battery is also activated in this case, and you'll see that the state of charge comes up. In this case it's saying 7%. Then this case they've selected the consumption path in this situation, and it will come up with the amount of watts on the side there. So once you've selected one of those, it will look for the meter. So it's just saying it's been activated, it's trying to find it, and once it's found it, then it will come up with OK and give you the power reading that it's actually reading from the consumption. The other thing as well there is your battery charging from other home producers in the network, deactivated or activated from that one. And then you go. So The next step would be then dynamic power. So dynamic power reduction is if you've got requirements from the network to have export limiting. So in this thing, if you don't have any export limits, then you just do no limit. Otherwise, if you did, then you tick here limit for entire system and then put in your total DC power of the size of the system. So not what the inverter is. So if you've got maybe 6 or 7 kilowatts on the inverter, then you would put that in as a watt value. And then you can either set the maximum feed in to the grid in a percentage, or you can set it as a watt value. Just remember, with the Symo Hybrid, with the normal grid connect inverters, we've brought out the zero feed-in or the zero export function, or actually down to minus 10%. With the hybrid, that's not available yet, so the minimum export of the hybrid is around 10%, so we can't get any lower than that. So, but being a three-phase 5 kilowatt inverter, there's usually very little call for export limiting with that. That function will be coming out later on this year as the zero export function. Don't have a definite date for it yet though, that's all. You've set that up, and it's basically going to say, okay, it's going to do the calibration charge, and depending on how you've got the settings set, if you can charge from the grid or not, then this may take a few hours. Okay, once you've done that, that's the technician wizard set up, and you'll see there'll be a tick next to the little man there on the screen. Then you want to then go to and start doing your Solarweb wizard, so you can actually see the monitoring on the on the site, so you can see what's going on Solarweb. Okay, so once you go into the Solarweb wizard, then it'll come up with this page again, which you shouldn't need to do any changes on it because you did that before. So it's getting confirmation that the general settings are correct, because sometimes some people may go do this at a later date. Then you've got your Solarweb connection, so this comes up with a thing saying that the data is encrypted going to our server. However, you need to install the latest firmware and things to make sure that that's all working properly. So once you've done that, then you've got Solarweb connection. So you've got the choice here of either a LAN connection and this symbol here, so if you've got a hardwire connection, or this connection here, which is then the Wi-Fi. This case, this example will do the Wi-Fi. So here you've got your WLAN, so your wireless LAN networks, which will show up. So your customer, when you're setting it up for them, you should see the customer's network. You then select that network and do connect, and then it will come up with enter password. So you put in the password there and hit save on there, and that will then go start trying to connect to the customer's network. So what will happen there, this will come up on your display. It will say the network connection is progress. Please connect your smart device to the chosen LAN network, and it will say the name of whichever one you've chosen. So what you want to do is connect your device to the customer's network to make sure that you've got a complete communication loop there. So you would go into your settings of the smart device. This particular case, the customer's network is called Data Logger. This is our test system. So you would connect to Data Logger. Then you would go back to the app. So you'd open the app again, and then you'll come up with this page. So it will do a bit of a search, and it'll come up with this page. So this will give you information about the IP address, your subnet mask, MAC address, if it's got the internet available, gateway, all this kind of stuff. So, but most of the time you won't need that, but this gives you information in case you do. So then the next step is then setting up the admin password. So the first password you set up in the technician wizard was a service password. So that's for a certain part of the settings of the hybrid manager. And then you've got the admin one, which is then covers the top section, which is the more basic settings of there. So again, you need to use letters and numbers for that. So once you've entered that, then it'll go through and you'll come up with your bar and you'll have your finished, and
this was what they'll ask you to go to the home page of the Datamanager, and then this is what it will come up with. So it does look a bit different to the normal Datamanager one. It has actually the picture on the interface exactly like this, so you can actually see exactly what's going on there, giving you the battery charge or the grid consumption, etc. So just to cover off some of the differences on the left-hand side here, when you go into the settings of the Hybrid Manager, there are a few additional parts there of the additional settings, additional tabs, as opposed to the normal Data Manager. So I'm just going to cover the ones which are not on the normal Data Manager. If you're looking to see what the information is on the other ones, then you can look at one of our other webinars where we've got some quick guides to give you more information on that, or the manuals. So I/O mapping, so what this does in this case, this is more of for looking into the future as well, introducing more functions for the Hybrid Manager. For example, when the Tesla comes out, then you'll be mapping the here for whichever you want to do it. So, for example, one of the pins here will be mapped for the logic high-low. There'll be some for the you've got the Modbus, and then be other ones for +12, and there'll be some other triggering. For example, if you've got the emergency backup or the emergency power supply function, a couple of these will also be mapped for that. So, for example, your contactor auxiliary feedback and your relay contact to trigger the contactor. So this can be configured in lots of different ways. You can configure it also for ramping control, etc. Then so Modbus, that is on the Data Manager as well, but just to give you a bit of an idea, you can see at the top here, see that it doesn't have the RS485, so that's not available for Modbus control. On here you can only use TCP on there. As I said before, because that's reserved for the meter, you can't use it for other kind of controlling. Then you've got here System Overview. So the last three here, System Overview, DNO Editor and Battery, they're all locked away in the Service menu. And then in the Admin menu, you've got all of these ones are in the Admin part. So let's say you did make a mistake or in the Technician Wizard and something was set up wrong, or let's say you did the Solarweb Wizard first, then you can. It's not the end of the world. You can still go back and do the system setup here via System Overview under that tab. So that's exactly the same thing that came up before when we were talking about, or if you want to do any changes to it, you can get into it that way. Then you've got your DNO editor. So again, if you want to do any dynamic power reduction at a later date, or doing battery charging from the grid, for example, for the calibration charge, you can allow that there as well. We can get it to that in a different spot there. Then you've got the battery tab here. So if you want to increase, for example, your minimum state of charge in operation or your charging current, don't see any reason why anyone would want to change that. So maximum of 16 amps is set here anyway, but if you did want to change it, you can. For example, minimum state of charge in operation, let's say you've mid-year you want to actually have the backup function, then you can maybe set that a bit higher so you can always ensure that you've got a bit of power left in the battery if you do go into backup mode on that. Then you've also got your battery service module replacement. So if you replace a module or you add a module to it, then it needs to be put into service mode, and because when the battery comes, or the replacement one or the new one comes, it's always at 53% state of charge. So in order to place that into the battery unit, you need to have all the rest of the modules at the same state of charge. So when you trigger that, it'll either then, depending if you're allowed to export to the grid, or if you've got load on, or if the batteries need to be charged, if they're below 53%, depending on if you've ticked charging from the grid or not, then it will charge up to that state of 53%. So that's that part there. If you're adding an extra module, then you would put in the activation key here. So on the side of the box, it'll have the like a serial number kind of thing, which you add in here, and you add that so that then it can recognize the battery. So on Solarweb, so once that's all been set up, then on Solarweb you'll see on this little picture here the actual state of charge of the battery as well, in the yellow. You see it going along, and also where these little yellow dots are is the battery mode. So that'll give you a few different things. So you could have it as disabled, which means it's just in sleep mode, the battery. Could also be that it's there's a problem with the communication, but if it goes into sleep, then it'll just be in disabled mode. Normal just means normal energy mode, of course. Then you've got the service mode. If that comes up, it'll actually show you on there and whereabouts that is. Charge boost is if the state of charge gets so low that it because it never gets charged, like something like that could happen in winter in Europe, then it will charge it up to 5% to make sure it stays at a decent level there. Then you've got nearly depleted, which is more of a service thing which would come through, and then calibrate as well. You'll see when a calibration charge takes place, you can then, you'll see that when it actually happens in there. So just going back to the settings there again as well. So battery management, here you can actually physically manually start the calibration charge if you wanted to. Then you've got another spot here if you want to change the battery charge from other producers in the home. This unlimited charging, this is more for Germany, this particular thing here, so reserving capacity, the unlimited charge. So they've got a rule in Germany that you have a 60% export rule if you have batteries. So this is to organise that you're not, with your 60% export limitation rule, that you're making the most of the battery there. To increase, if you're increasing capacity, I think I covered that a little bit before. So once you've got into the service mode, switch off the battery and add the new one to it. So you can see here on the side of the battery you have your service code, your activation key, which you then put into here. So I just covered that before. So yeah, you go do the service charge. Once that's come up with okay, it's ready to do, then you put in the battery, put in the activation key, and then away you go. Okay, so in terms of your monitoring, once you've got that set up on Solarweb, then this is what it'll look like here. This is an example here of a system. You'll have then the battery as the fourth leg now. So if you had a smart meter on them before, you would have just had your 3 legs, and now you have your fourth. So you have your state of charge, what it's charging with, and the rest of the other features on there too. And here, as I said, on the Solarweb, you'll see this curve here with now the battery status through there. One thing I did want to cover is, which you get asked quite often, it's not so much to do with the setting up of the Symo Hybrid or the hybrid manager itself. It's more to do with the system itself, and there's a lot of people asking about what happens because it's a 3-phase inverter. What actually happens with single-phase loads, and how does that actually work? People think that their battery is getting can't supply enough power on one of the phases, so what happens to the rest of the energy? So just give you a bit of an explanation of how that works. So in this example, just for ease of calculation, we've got a 3 kilowatt inverter with 3 kilowatts of modules with 100% efficiency, so there's no losses in the system. And the inverter is in grid connect mode, so it is, as you can see here, it's actually connected to the grid. So if that's producing full power, so you've got 1 kilowatt per phase. So in Australia, the 3-phase grid connect inverters have to have a balanced output. The utilities require it. So even if it's an unbalanced load, the inverter will always have a balanced output regardless. So in this situation, we'll do a bit of analysis. So you can see here, just because it's a white piece of paper, I've got blue, black and red instead of the white phase. But let's use it phase 1, 2 and 3. So you've got here phase 1 here, the red phase. Let's say that's got here 1 kilowatt worth of load. The black phase here has got 0 and the blue phase has got 2. So in this situation, the inverter is producing 1 kilowatt. There's 1 kilowatt of load, so all the power from the inverter is going into the load. So none's actually going out to the grid. So you can see red phase there, L1, is 0 watts going out. Then you've got on so the next one here, where are we here? So phase 2, there's 0 watts load, so that whole 1 kilowatt is then going to the grid in this case. So you're exporting 1 kilowatt in L2. Then L3 is 1 kilowatts going from the inverter, but it's a 2 kilowatt load, so you're pulling in actually 1 kilowatt from the grid. So this could be from the battery or from the PV. It doesn't really matter from the inverter at all. But in this case, I've had that quite often, that people have said, oh, well, that's no good because I'm exporting for 6 cents on L2, and then on L3 I'm importing at 25 cents or whatever your grid feed tariff is. So that's making a loss there. But that's not how all the utility meters work here in Australia. The 3-phase meters, utility meter and the 3-phase Fronius smart meter, works the same, and that is that it adds up all the phases together, and whatever they equal is then what you get charged for. So in terms of electron flow, you are exporting on one phase and you're importing on the other, but in terms of cost, it's all equaled out and is 0. So there's no cost in that. So that's the same with the battery. With that, if you're importing or exporting, it doesn't matter. So when we get an island mode though, that's a bit more trickier to do, because if you've got a balanced inverter, you don't always have 3-phase loads on a 3-phase site. So if you do have single-phase loads, that means that there'll be power in the neutral here. So just going through the same scenario again here, you've got 1 kilowatt on phase 1, 0 on phase 2, and 2 kilowatts on phase 3. In this case, what will happen is, because you can see we're disconnected from the grid, so any imbalance can't be pulled in or out of the grid anymore. It has to come from the inverter. So in this particular case, the difference, you can have an unbalanced mode, and the inverter can cope with unbalanced loads on there. So it's 2.5 kilowatts as a maximum on one of the phases. So you could have a 3 kilowatt inverter there and have 2.5 kilowatts on one phase and basically nothing on the other. So in island mode, it does work differently. So the additional power goes through the neutral in this case. Okay, all right. Well, that's pretty much the webinar for today. I'll just let me have a look and see if there's anyone got any questions out there. I know Marcus and Ballard, you've been answering some questions out there. So if someone has asked here over the questionnaire is, do I have to turn on the backup without battery settings? So with that, no. It'll be once because you need it for the backup mode, you need to have a contactor in the switchboard, and that then disconnects from the grid, and the inverter recognizes that that's disconnected from the grid and will then start up in island mode. So there's a better delay of, let's say, 5 seconds at the moment, but because the function's not there, we don't have the exact details for that. But there's no actual setting needed for that. It'll just be a software update on the inverter anyway. So when that function does come, it will be a software update. And then you'll need your 3-pole contactor and a small relay and auxiliary contact in the main switchboard for that. Okay, so let's see if there's any other questions that anyone has. Just feel free to ask. Otherwise, that's
that's pretty much it for today. What we'll do is we'll try and get the presentation as a handout for you, and if anyone's interested in having that, then we can send that out to you too as a PDF. Otherwise, thanks a lot for your participation. So one last question there. Someone's asked me there, when do you release the Primo Hybrid? So all the discussions today has been from the three-phase version. So the single-phase hybrid's planned for the end of the year. So it releases planned for the end of the year as a Primo Hybrid, and power classes should be 4.6, 5, a 6, 8, and a 10. So okay, all right. So if anyone else has got any questions, I think that's it. So thanks a lot for your attendance, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot.